Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. I see folks still trickling in, but I'm going to kick us off for the sake of time. Welcome to the third electric truck boot camp training. Today we're going to be talking about charging, specifically about power management and resilience. And as a reminder, the Electric Truck Bootcamp is our 10-part educational series as part of the lead up to Run on Less Electric this fall. Next slide, please. Those of you not familiar with Run on Less Electric yet, we will be tracking 13 real-world electric trucks in operation across the US and Canada, sharing key metrics and data from their operations to help the industry learn from a lot of these leaders across the continent. Run on Less Electric is an event hosted by NACFE, the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, in partnership with RMI. And you can see a little bit about who will be participating here on your screen. We've got a great diversity of vehicles that we'll be sharing data on. As I mentioned, 13 vehicles in total. That includes 3 vans, 3 medium-duty box trucks, 1 heavy-duty truck, 4 heavy-duty tractors in drayage and regional haul, as well as 2 terminal tractors in the group. So our biggest Run on Less event ever. If you would like to learn more about what's happening this fall, you can go to the website on your screen, runonless.com. There's a ton of great info, as well as contact information if you have questions. We will be kicking off the run at ACT Expo this fall. Next slide. If you would like to join us at ACT Expo, there's a discount code on the screen that you can use to register. And I did see that ACT Expo made the agenda live this week. So go on, check it out, see what's going to be going on. NACFE and RMI will be there. We'll be hosting a half-day workshop as part of the expo to talk through a lot of the learnings that come out of this boot camp that you're on right now. So without further ado, next slide. I want to talk about what we've covered so far. I mentioned this is the third in a series of 10. Earlier this month, we started our conversation around charging, talking about planning and build out, really focused on the hardware and what it looks like to plan for these electric truck deployments, what sorts of chargers you might need, how that all works. If you missed the last training, there is a video recording available online on the website. I encourage you to check it out. And then a quick note about what's coming up next. On the next slide, we can see we'll be covering how to work with your utility on June 1st. So 2 weeks from today, same time, same place. We'll be hearing from a variety of utilities across the continent around how they're thinking about electric trucks from their perspective and kind of best practices, particularly for fleets looking to have that coordination early and often. I can tell you are going to be key. And if you would like to test your knowledge and earn your electric truck expert badge, which can be shared on social media with your networks, there are quizzes after each boot camp training that you can take on that website. It'll ask you to take 5 seconds, create a quick login, and you'll be able to take a quiz. They each go live after the training is complete. So there's now 3 available after today. You can earn a novice badge for each one, or if you do complete all 10 between now and this fall, you can earn your electric truck expert badge. Next slide. So today, I mentioned we're going to be talking charging, power management, and resilience. Next slide. As I mentioned last time, we get the most questions about charging when it comes to electric trucks. By far, most of the questions that I hear from the industry, whether it's from fleets, fleet managers, utilities, policymakers, there are a lot of questions around charging. And so while we did cover the hardware piece planning last time, I'm really excited. We have a great group on today to talk about some of the additional details that we need to think through as we're planning for these deployments. And I want to be sure to thank today's sponsor, Electrify. It is through their support of Run on Less Electric and this boot camp that we're able to offer all of these webinars for free to the public. So thank you so much, and you are going to hear from Electrify later on in today's call. Next slide. So before we get started, a few quick housekeeping items. You'll notice a Q&A box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Please do feel free to submit Q&A as they come to you. While folks are presenting, we're going to set aside the last 15-20 minutes for Q&A. So we're looking forward to answering your questions. We'll also be reviewing the questions that we don't have time for after the webinar and incorporating that into some of our analysis coming out of this boot camp, that workshop at ACT Expo I mentioned, etc. I also want to note that a recording of today's webinar will be available on the website, both on ACT News and Run on Less, and you'll receive an email link by early next week. So you'll get a copy of the slides as well as a link to the recording. And there will be a quick survey at the end. We appreciate your feedback. If you're able to take that, let us know what you loved, what we could improve on for the next 7. And lastly, if you are experiencing any technical issues, there is some contact information on your screen. Next slide. So, as I've kind of already talked through, charging is about much more than just hardware. You can see a couple graphics on the screen. These are taken from our Amping Up Charging Infrastructure for Electric Trucks report that NACFE and RMI released a couple years back. Luckily, a lot has happened in terms of real-world deployments, lessons learned from what is happening in the real world. But one thing that is still true is that in order to be successful with your charging, it does require thinking through more than just, power levels of chargers or what make and model charger you're going to get. There's a lot that goes into charging, including software, networking, maintenance, etc. Some of these topics that we're going to talk through today. And the 2 main subjects we're hoping to cover with you this afternoon are, next slide. First of all, we're going to talk through managed charging. You might hear it called smart charging. Basically what this means is just understanding that charging isn't as simple as just plugging in a truck to a charger and letting it do its thing, max power output the whole time. There are considerations that fleets who are successful with charging are working into their plans. And a lot of that has to do with utilities. I mentioned we'll talk more about utilities next month. But 2 items I do want to call out here that should be top of mind for anyone thinking about managed charging would relate to rates from your utility and basically how you can optimize your electricity rates to have the lowest electricity bill possible, right? No one wants to see extra charges, whether it's because you were charging during what's called peak hours when a lot of folks tend to be using electricity. Sometimes we see utilities implement time of use pricing, which you can see on the left here, or maybe it's most expensive to charge right in the afternoon when everyone's, getting home from work, starting to run the dishwasher, do laundry. Whereas it might be cheapest to charge, in the middle of the night where there's not a lot of electricity being used. And then on the right here, this is an example from the bus sector. So I do want to note this isn't trucks, but this is from a study that CalSTART put together looking at demand charges, which is a particular rate issue that some utilities will charge you more money, not just based on how much electricity you use, but based on the max amount you use at any one point. And if you haven't seen a graph like this, basically the takeaway is that demand charges can actually be the majority of your bill if that's something that your utility incorporates into your bill and it's not something that you're planning for. This is also showing the ability to reduce those demand charges, looking at managed charging. So if you go to the next slide real quick, I'm going to wrap it up quickly, but I do want to mention we are also going to talk today about resilience. This is something, again, that we get a lot of questions about, particularly over the last year, where we've seen headlines like what's on the screen, whether it's wildfires in California, meaning that the grid is not always available when we want it to be, or what we saw this past winter in Texas, where again, the grid was not available to everyone. If you're looking at or have electric trucks that need to be charged, understandably, there are concerns around how can we ensure that my trucks are available for me to operate when I need them to. Very important question. And again, we've got some great experts on the line to talk us through what the options are and how fleets leading the way are really thinking about these issues. So next slide. Today, we're going to hear from these 5 guest speakers on the screen. We're going to start things off with Levi Loneland, who is a Senior Account Executive in charge of West Coast Business Development with Electrify. And Levi's going to give us a great introduction into what the heck is this managed charging we're talking about and why you should care. So with that, Levi, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Jesse, thank you so much for the intro, and I appreciate you all having me today. So as Jesse had mentioned, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Levi Lomlin. I'm a senior account executive with Electrify. And among my duties on the West Coast, I really focus on managing the deployment of our software product that really just helps fleets simplify charging, help manage their actual demand, and ensures that their vehicles are essentially ready to go when they need to use them at the lowest possible cost. So in doing that, we tend to run into a lot of the questions and challenges that fleets are talking about on a daily basis as they're beginning to scale their electric fleets. So NACFE's brought me in today to talk a little bit about some of those challenges and how managed charging can impact them. So without further ado, if you want to jump into the next slide, we'll jump right into it. Great. So one of the key challenges that keeps coming up in the conversations that we're having daily related to electrification is the challenge of capacity and how that relates to demand threshold. So does the grid have enough capacity to handle fleet electrification on a large scale? Capacity is unique because it has an inversely proportional relationship to demand. So when we talk about that in simple terms, the more trucks that we plug into the grid, the less available capacity during peak times. And so it really begs the question, how do we solve this challenge of managing our energy efficiently in order to manage the demand threshold? So the solution there really lies in two places. We can either produce more energy, or we can utilize the energy that's available to us on the grid more efficiently. So it's our position at Electrify that it's really going to take kind of a combination of both. But the problem that we're really tackling and solving is, how do we look at the grid, look at its availability, and use it more efficiently, as well as use the resources available to you more efficiently to manage this demand threshold challenge. So what this visual really shows, if you track the dotted line that comes across, is the managed demand threshold. And what that is a representation of is the work that utility companies are doing years and months in advance to help determine how much power or how much energy is going to need to be delivered to the grid on a daily basis to serve our electric needs for our everyday lives. High peak loads and plugging multiple trucks in, or just drawing a lot of energy, is the biggest challenge to this. You can see here as it breaches, this is what Jesse was referring to as in incurring demand charges. Anytime a fleet essentially breaches the managed demand threshold, they run the risk of running up their costs and causing additional challenges on the grid. So by managing your energy more effectively in times of demand, we can help managing the demand threshold, keep your costs low, and essentially make your fleet electrification a resounding success. Next slide, please. Higher peak loads and demand threshold can actually create a host of different issues. If peak demand is not necessarily managed or controlled appropriately, a lot of times it can lead to the need to upgrade your infrastructure in terms of higher capacity transformers. And usually what that relates to the end user is additional costs, not only in operational expense, but also in costs of time. So transformers and upgrades like this, they take a lot of planning on behalf of both the customer and the utility. In some cases, we see delays of up to 12 to 18 months as customers are working to electrify their fleets, but also trying to understand what type of transformer would be optimal for their use, whether or not they need a dedicated transformer, or they can continue to use a transformer that might share a load between their charging infrastructure and their current building, and what that's going to look like for the future for them. So many fleets are actually starting this process early, talking to utilities, planning, understanding what the load is going to look like when they do scale up their electric fleet, to help them understand what their infrastructure needs are well in advance before electrifying. Next slide, please. Another issue that we're seeing with fleet managers that just really adds to the complexity is the factor of operational complexity. So fleets, as we know it today, they're very comfortable and they're very used to running internal combustion engines. And even those fleets themselves are very complex, whether it's a mix of gas and diesel, a mix of vehicles that have multiple different gross vehicle weights or provide different functions within the fleet and the fleet jobs itself. The challenge of operational complexity is a layer is essentially just added onto that operational complexity when adding battery electric vehicles. And the reason that is because most fleets are looking at phasing in battery electric vehicles. So they're going to have to continue to manage their internal combustion engines and their battery electric vehicles. Understanding how to merge those two, whether it's through a single interface, and simplify some of the charging operations. Since when managing an electric vehicle fleet, you have to consider things like route distance, the topography, weather conditions, battery aging or degradation, the vehicle efficiency, so many different factors that come into electric vehicles. Simplifying that can be really important to the success of an electrical vehicle deployment. Next slide, please. So luckily, we have a ton of intelligent people that are working on this. And the first thing that they did was really build out a framework of different solutions and protocols for us to help really kind of lay a map of what needs to happen in order to have successful electric vehicle deployments. Some of the protocols and standards that are really important to manage charging are OCPP, the Open Charge Point Protocol. And essentially what this does is it allows all of your electric vehicle infrastructure to communicate with one another cohesively. The second thing that's really important about the protocols and the solutions that have been put forth is it allows us to capture and track the data more in a more controllable environment. So with that, we can start to make more intelligent decisions and build software around tracking and understanding this data in a manner that's actually going to be useful to fleets and fleet electrification. Next slide, please. Which brings us to our solution. So this is all made possible through a process of essentially planning ahead, blending your infrastructure, and applying intelligent software so that your infrastructure essentially talks, or your infrastructure essentially communicates and delivers the solution that you're looking for. So you're talking about planning ahead, using an electric infrastructure planning team, thinking things through is really paramount. I know that we'll touch on that a little bit later in this conversation. Blending your infrastructure, such as renewables, microgrids, and other resources that you might have in order to increase resilience, and then applying that with the use of intelligent software. So really, software's job in all of this is to make all of your different charging infrastructure talk to one another and determine what electrons need to be moved where at the lowest possible cost and in the most efficient manner. By deploying software, you can see just in this visual alone, the impact that it can have on unmanaged charging. The two real key factors that it has for fleets is that it helps avoid incurring demand charges and manages your demand threshold, and it helps you stretch your infrastructure farther. So this in turn can help you plan in the future when you're scaling up electric vehicles. It helps reduce your costs by keeping your energy costs low and charging your vehicles in the most opportune times and lowest cost windows. And then lastly, by stretching your infrastructure farther, you can essentially plan on bringing in more vehicles and utilizing your infrastructure to the maximum capability that it has. And that's all I have for you guys today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Levi, for that excellent overview of managed charging. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Up next, we are going to hear from Scott Fisher, the Vice President of Fleets and OEMs at Greenlots, who is going to share with us some information about some real-world case studies and what Greenlots has learned to date. Scott, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jesse. Yeah, so quick intro. Yeah, Scott Fisher. I oversee the fleet and OEM commercial team at Greenlots. In 2019, we were bought by Shell, and whereas Greenlots business had historically been with cities and utilities, since we've been bought by Shell and Shell has a significant fleet business, we have put a lot of time and effort into thinking about the solutions that are required for fleet electrification, and even I'm starting to work with some of Shell's fleet customers to do this as they start to make the transition to electrification. Jesse, you can go to the next page. So I think I'm going to spend a couple of minutes probably echoing and putting a little bit more color into the great background that Levi gave earlier. And one of the things that Levi talked about was some of the complexity that fleets are dealing with when it comes to electric fleets deal with that electric fleets haven't had to deal with when they were gas fleets or diesel fleets. And that includes things like how quickly can the vehicle charge? How big is the battery? What's the existing state of charge on the vehicle? And you could very easily imagine setting up a site where the vehicle comes in, it just starts charging at the charging station to like its fullest speed. And the vehicle is done charging, and as this graphic illustrates, it may or may not be right when the vehicle is needed to be charged. It may be 5 hours later when the vehicle needs to go out. And so one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, can one of our optimization aspects be maybe we slow down the charge rate? And I think one or two of the charts that Levi was talking about really illustrate why that's critical. If you go to the next page. So we've been thinking, and this is a bit of a illustrative version. I've got kind of a real world version in a second, but given a particular fleet, we can start to think about if there's a particularly high demand charge at a period of time, or if there's time of use rates that we don't want the fleet to be subject to, can we space out the charging? So maybe sometimes we're not charging, maybe sometimes we're lowering the charge rate. And obviously this is something that maybe an individual can do without software for a couple of vehicles, but when you start to get into a fleet with the complexity of different times that the vehicles are leaving, different charge rates, different types of charging stations, it becomes more challenging, and that's where you do need software, as Levi was describing, to help manage that. Go to the next page. I wanted to show an example of, this is a fleet that we've been working with in California, where the rate is a higher rate from 4 to 9 p.m. And so let me just describe for a second what the data is that you're looking at here. So this is from I pulled data from mid-February to mid-March of this year. And each of the black line represents the load throughout the day. The green line represents the average load for the 30-day period. And then the purple line represents the peak load that we saw during that time. And so what you can see here is we worked with this customer to set it up, even though the peak period is from 4 to 9 p.m. The customer felt more comfortable, especially since this is really a pilot project, setting up the fleet, setting up the managed charging to work during a 2-hour period. So as you can see here, from 4 to 6 p.m. During each day is when we set the charging to charge at a much lower rate. When I first saw this, I was kind of wondering, why are there still 4 squiggly lines well above that from 4 to 6 p.m. And so what I was told is we didn't turn the algorithm on Sundays because the peak rate didn't apply on Sundays. So you can kind of see like the way fleets are starting to think about doing this in the real world, where in this particular case, it may have been that we could have spent a little bit more time at a lower, from the entire 4 to 9 p.m. period, but really the customer was very focused on, the vehicles being ready. But I suspect as we start to do more of these with these and other customers, the level of comfort for having a lower charge speed during a longer period of time may be greater. And it also introduces new questions like, hey, is it worth maybe getting higher power charging stations to make it go quicker, to make sure that you can have a lower, there's obviously a trade-off between the more capacity that you use versus optimizing the rates, but it introduces interesting questions about how do you set up the site. Go to the next page. So one of the things that Jesse asked us to talk about too was resiliency. And when I first started thinking about fleets, I spend a lot of time thinking about these software issues and managed charging issues that I was just going through, and those are critical. As we've done a couple of, let's say, pilot projects or early deployment type projects, a couple of other issues have come to the fore, and I might not use exactly the term resilience because it's not necessarily when the grid is down, but it's really how do we keep the charging stations operational. And Jesse mentioned that there are different components, right? There's the hardware that might be manufactured by a company. There might be software that's manufactured by a different company. Then there's actually vehicles themselves that might be manufactured by a third company. And I think as we started to go into these pilot projects, I don't know that we appreciated the amount of work that has to be done to test that whole setup. And we assumed, as Levi mentioned, that we assumed, okay, there's OCBP, that's the standard between the software and the charging stations. The vehicles are set up with J1772 or CCS connectors, so all of that should just work. And what we found, at least to date, is that it's just assuming that it's going to work is probably not a good assumption, and it's worth it planning into a project, a validation efforts or testing before you start really down the path with the project. With one of our customers, we've got a 3 to 5 month validation process that we bake in before we're starting to haul, or they're starting to haul critical load that's mission critical. We do want to bake in some time to make sure all those pieces work together. I think there will come a time in the industry when we won't have to do that. At Greenlots, we've invested in a validation center near our corporate office in Los Angeles that can bring in trucks. We have all the different charging stations out there. We can test them and see if it works. And often it doesn't work the first time, and we're working with the respective engineers and the different companies to make sure that it all comes together. Next page. And just lastly, I wanted to talk about a project, and I noticed it was one of the projects on the graphic that Jesse put up at the beginning, this Volvo LIGHTS project, where we've had the opportunity to work with a number of other companies, including G&A. I'll give it a shout out to one of our leads here, right? And Volvo, some of the charging manufacturers, to create a project where the first iteration of the Volvo electric trucks have been introduced into the North American market and are hauling goods and services from like the ports in Southern California inland. And I think a couple of the lessons learned that I just wanted to mention from that project, and we've now got the charging stations installed and they're starting to be used as of the last couple of months. Certainly lesson learned is that there've been many stakeholders, right? The site host fleet, the utility, the auto OEM, hardware manufacturer, Greenlots. And so there really needs to be somebody, and we certainly do this service, but others can as well, to bring all of that stuff together to make it work. And testing, which I mentioned earlier, is clearly an important part of that. But just to make sure that there's an integrated PM approach to making these projects work. Everybody's doing it kind of first for their first time or as an early time. So thinking about the PM approach is really important. Also, all of the Volvo customers who are involved in this, yes, they are recognizing that this has grant funding and this is a pilot project, but they're all also thinking about how do we get to the point where this is a cheaper type of deployment than buying diesel. And so we and the rest of the stakeholders are thinking through those topics a lot to say, not only is it what do we need to do to get to the next day to make sure this project is successful and implement the requirements of the grant, but also to see how this can be scaled because it's economic. So with that, I will pass it back to Jesse and appreciate your time. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for being here and for sharing those takeaways from Greenlot's experience. Up next, we're going to hear from Namit Singh, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Microgrid Labs. And Namit is going to speak with us really on this topic of resilience and what planning for resilience looks like. Namit, over to you.
Sounds good. Hey, everyone. Thank you, NACFE. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. Really excited to be here. And we'll talk a little bit about our work in the fleet electrification space and how planning is important for that and how you integrate microgrids and plan for resiliency, plan for a reduction in overall operating cost, and how all of that comes together under the umbrella of microgrid. So next slide, please. So when being a fleet, when you are talking about electrifying your fleet or transitioning from the to the zero emission fleet, you are not responsible for just buying an electric vehicle. So it's not going to be that, okay, let me go and buy what is available in the market. But you are responsible for buying the vehicle. You are responsible for right sizing the vehicle. What is the battery size? What are the specifications of the vehicles? Does it work for your duty cycle and for your location? Then you are responsible for the charging infrastructure as well, that for if and when my whole fleet is electrified, what type of charging infrastructure do I need? How many chargers? What type? What size? How do I operate it? Can the electrical infrastructure at your location support it? Do you need upgrades? All of those things put in together. And then comes a key piece of energy infrastructure, where you have to look at, can I generate my own electricity by using solar or anything of that sort for, let's say, for reducing my total cost of operations, for reducing my emissions, for building resiliency? All of those things put together, these are the things which you have to consider as a fleet, and not just a single, let me go and buy a vehicle. Next slide, please. So the challenge that comes up is all of these factors are interrelated and tied to each other. So you cannot just make decision on one front and not worry about the next one. So you have to take all of these into consideration and talk about all of this as one system. Next slide, please. The challenge is further when you go deeper into each one of these, there are so many different factors which again are complexly related to each other. So there are like 40-50 factors which you have to consider and take into consideration and make sure that all of those are absolutely perfect and optimized in order for you to get the best system. Next slide, please. So just to look at, and that is what determines overall your cost of electricity that you buy. Just to give some examples, Jesse touched upon it a little bit earlier. So time of use, that basically determines that at what point or what time in the day do you buy electricity. You can think of it as if you fill up your diesel tank at 8 in the morning, the cost will be $3 per gallon. If you do it afternoon, it will be 4.5. If you do it in the evening, it is 6.5. So it's not a small fluctuation, but as you can see, the cost usually is about double or even triple. So that means that you have to really plan for when you fill up your tank. Next slide, please. So the next example is demand charge, as everyone has touched upon. I'll just briefly talk about it. So what it means is how many of these vehicles you are charging at one point in time. So if you have 100 vehicles, are you charging all of them at one point in time? That is what will determine your overall cost of electricity at the end of the month. And we've seen again and again that there are projects which basically get stumped just because of this. Next slide, please. And then there are other even more complex ones where it is like your cost of electricity will be given to you a day ahead or even in real time, which is given a few hours ahead. So to plan for all of these things and look at this in detail, and there are more than 3,000 utilities in the country. So to know what is going on for each one of them for your location is extremely important. So using technology, and that is the point and discussing here. Next slide, please. That is what is important, that use a charge management system which allows you to make sure that when you are charging, you are doing it at the lowest possible cost and make sure your fleet is able to fulfill the duty that it is supposed to. So starting from bottom left, all your vehicles will be connected to all your chargers, but the charge management system gets the information from the utility, and that is what is able to tell each and every charger when to charge, when to stop, and at what power level to charge at. So this is the most basic charge management system which we recommend that everyone should absolutely have. And moving forward, next slide please, that's where you have more complex ones which look at the whole system. So bottom left you can see now you have your whole fleet, you have your full charging infrastructure, you have your facility loads, you may have on-site solar generation, battery storage, any other sort of generation. So the more complex ones are the ones which look at this whole thing as a system and then optimizes your operation at the system level. And that is where it is able to, at every point in time, in real time, make sure that your cost of operation is the lowest, your fleet is always able to meet the operations that it is supposed to. And this is where it is able to integrate, as shown here, solar and storage. So your resiliency requirements, that what happens to my fleet when there is no electricity once I have converted everything to electric. So that is where during the planning phase you have to really look into it and say that what is your plan, that if there is no electricity and I have 100% electric fleet, how do I support it? Do I pick up a few vehicles? Do my vehicles operate a few hours a day? So these are the kind of things you need to take into consideration during planning phase, and based on that, build the system. Next slide, please. So a real world example, this is from one of our projects in Boston, where we are operating about 55 heavy duty vehicles. So the red line, which is the topmost, that is uncontrolled charging. So in this case, the load comes to close to 5 megawatt. So with controlled charging, these are the different ways of controlling, different sophistication in the controller. You are able to bring it further down by spreading it out. But just to give some cost estimate, that what we are talking about, by just implementing a software layer of controller, you can reduce your operating cost. This is about 55 buses, so you can reduce your cost by about $56,000 a month just by bringing in the controller. So that's a major difference between controlled and uncontrolled charging. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, this is one of the projects that we are doing in Colorado. So here, this is a way of doing it, that you can actually cover your complete parking lot and produce your own electricity, reduce your emissions, build a microgrid in this particular way. These car ports or the bus ports or these ports are so high that your trucks and the fleet can actually go under it without altering any of the flow or the traffic flow. The key takeaway that we would have, what we would say is, when you're talking about fleet electrification, you are responsible for the whole system. So do take that into consideration, and when you are doing the system level design, look at it on day one. This should not be an afterthought that let me just buy the vehicles and then I'll figure it out. But you are able to optimize the whole system by looking at everything on day one. I'll stop right there. Thank you so much, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Please absolutely feel free to reach out. Glad to be here, and would love to help in any capacity. Back to you, Jesse. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Namit. Up next, we are going to hear from Pamela McDougall, Senior Manager of Grid Modernization at the Environmental Defense Fund. And Pamela is going to share with us a really interesting study that EDF recently did with some real-world heavy-duty truck data. Pamela, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse, in particular for letting me present this study. This study was actually over a year in development. When we started envisioning this study, which was performed by GNA, we really wanted to be sure that we were covering a particularly challenged fleet, really basing the analysis on real fleet data and not typical academic style imagined fleet behavior. And also we really wanted to include existing technology and up and coming technologies. And because of that, the key findings or the key goals of the study was really firstly to determine based on if a fleet was able to electrify. And we chose two fleets that we evaluated. Both were Class 8 trucks. One was NFI with using 50 trucks, and the other was Schneider with 42 trucks. And we really wanted to evaluate if they were able to electrify without changing any of their operations using existing charging infrastructure technology. We also evaluated what the total cost of this infrastructure was, including using existing rebates, programs, distributed energy resources as well, such as solar and storage. And finally, we also evaluated what the cost of charging was for both fleets, both using managed charging, various rates that were being offered in California, and the impact of installing solar and storage at their depots to see if we could bring down their annual charging costs. As you can see, the fleets do have high annual VMTs. They were class 8, and they do, we were able to gather 1 year's worth of like high resolution telemetry data on every single one of their trucks, which was pretty important. Next slide. So before I get into like some of the existing the key results that came out, I really want to talk about the takeaways and the high level takeaways that EDF found from this study. The first thing that was really surprising for me, given these were 2 class 8 truck depots, was that most of all of their routes were able to be electrified using existing technology, which for me is something contradictory to what I've heard for class 8 trucks, at least today. So I was really surprised for that and pleased. The second key finding was the impact of managed charging and on-site solar and storage was actually critical to making their fleet's infrastructure affordable. And that's both the infrastructure of the fleets to bring down their charging costs, but also the infrastructure costs of the utility and the grid itself. The third finding that we had was that the costs were pretty significant for charging infrastructure. Well, I'm not going to get into the details of that in this presentation. For the 2 fleets, we had a range between 10 million and 40 million per depot for these trucks. That's depending on how advanced the charging was and how much solar and storage you installed. But the upfront capital cost is significant. And therefore, we do really see the need for policies and programs to help reduce infrastructure costs, in particular for class 8 trucks right now. Next slide. Diving into the results themselves, though, and how we came to these key takeaways. As you can see in the top table here, focusing on the third line here, the number of successful trips. When we compare Schneider and NFI, Schneider, we were able to, using existing technology, electrify about 88% of their trips. And for NFI, using current technology, 71%, and 93% if we use advanced. And by advanced, we really mean up and coming or announced infrastructure that is set to be out in the next year or so. So those results for us is already pretty great, and that's not even changing any of their driving routes or operations. And another really important finding that we found is when we compared their cost of charging, so the cost of electricity per year, and the cost of diesel per year for these fleets, we're already seeing savings in the order of like $500,000 to $750,000 per year. So we are seeing significant fuel cost savings when you do electrify already, at least in California. Next slide. Another thing that we really wanted to evaluate was the impact of smart charging or managed charging, which has been discussed already, we also evaluated the impact of managed charging on various rates that were on the ground. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of what every rate is. They talked about time of use. We also evaluated a demand holiday and demand subscription, which are 2 other rates that I'm sure Jesse at some point in these workshops will be discussing. But really the important finding here is when we compared these fleets' abilities to shift their charging times without impacting their operations, they already saw savings of about 100,000 for every rate class that they were applied to. And that can be a significant portion for a fleet. And if you're having a fleet, for example, that has higher dwell times, these fleets did not have high dwell times, you would imagine even higher savings. But smart charging does, even for class 8 trucks and high VMT fleets, save money for fleets. So it's very important to consider that up front. Next slide. And finally, what I think is really vitally important for enabling these fleets to electrify and reduce their cost of charging is to install on-site distributed energy resources such as solar and storage. And for these two fleets, we really found that it both enabled them to have net positive net present value with their charging infrastructure only in the presence of solar and storage, but also looking at their charging costs, we were able to have savings of up to $1 million per year, depending on what rate you are and how big your load is. So that is a really huge savings if you're installing solar and storage and coupling it with managed charging up front. Next slide. And I think those are the main findings that we found in this study. I'm happy to, if you have any questions or would like to actually read this study, I have published a blog on it, and EDF has all of the results online. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Pamela. And we're getting close to time, so I'm going to quickly turn it over to Christy Lewis, last but not least, our Director of Analysis at Watt Time. And Christy is going to talk with us about what Watt Time is, as well as how you can think about optimizing not just for lowest cost, but also for cleanest electricity use. Christy, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jesse. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So, as Jesse mentioned, I'm also going to be talking about benefits of managed charging, but with a little bit of a twist. I'm going to be talking about the emissions benefits you can see by managing charging based on the emissions rate of the grid you're charging from. So just to start, a little bit about Watt Time. We are a tech nonprofit, which is kind of a small field. There aren't many of us out there. And we're dedicated to accelerating the development and spread of sustainability techniques. So we joined forces with Rocky Mountain Institute in 2017 as a subsidiary organization. And so we work closely with RMI on various projects. So what we actually do is we work to understand grid emissions at a highly granular level and build tools to help others use that information to maximize impact. So what we're going to be looking at today is one of our core products, which is the creation of marginal emissions rates every 5 minutes for every grid in the United States and about 26 countries. We use this data and we send it to device partners, software companies, whoever is managing the electricity of a specific device, whether it's an electric vehicle or a thermostat. We send them our emission signal in real time, and they can control the electricity use of that device according to the emissions of the grid. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So this might be a bit of a review for many of you, but I just want to go over electricity sources, and that the electricity that charges your electric truck comes from a variety of sources. So throughout the rest of the presentation, we're going to be looking at these 4 grids. So I'll explain a little bit in more detail about them. Starting with a grid early on in the renewable energy transition and ending with a grid that's much farther along in the renewable transition. So on the far right, we have the northern Colorado, southern Wyoming grid called Wacom. And this is a very coal-heavy grid. This grid actually has the most coal of any grid in the United States, over 80%, and a very small amount of renewable energy, tiny amount of wind. And then if you go one to the left, we're looking at a coal renewable mix. This is the Great Plains area. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, kind of like all along the middle part of the United States. It's a grid called SPP. And SPP still has a large amount of fossil fuels, but has about 25% of wind, which is the most amount of wind of any grid in the United States. And so we'll look at that in detail later. Next along the transition is New York. So when a grid gets to the point where it has retired all of its coal, it has mostly gas, natural gas on the grid, and has a tiny amount of renewable energy as well. You can see they have about 5% wind, but mostly natural gas and nuclear. And then finally, we have California, which I'd say, as far as US grids, is the farthest along in integrating renewables. They have about 35% variable renewable energy, just a small amount, maybe a third natural gas to help balance things out. You want to go to the next slide? Great. Okay, so then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the grid is operated. I'm not sure how many people here in the electricity space are mostly just mobility, but this is a good way to level set on knowledge. So a grid operator dispatches all of the renewable or the energy sources on a grid in order of the least cost. So they start with the lowest cost resource and then keep on adding resources until they get to the current electricity demand. This happens every 5 minutes on the grid. So if we have the dotted line as the current electricity demand, and we start by dispatching the lowest cost, which would be renewables. So you can go to the next slide. So start with wind and solar. Those are often the cheapest because they don't have fuel costs. And go to the next slide. And then if it's a hydro grid or a grid with hydro on it, they'll add in some hydro because that also can be pretty inexpensive. And to the next slide. And then they add fossil fuels. So here we see natural gas and some coal being added to the grid. And then the next slide. And then some more natural gas. And so as you can see at this point, the grid has met all of the needs for the demand at that instantaneous moment. And natural gas was the last generator to come online to meet the demand. And so next slide, please. You can imagine that if you have a different amount of demand at a different time, you're going to be affecting a different resource. So I just wanted to explain this to show that when you increase your electricity demand at a specific time and place, you're not affecting all of the resources, you're really just affecting one of them. And so if you were to start charging a bunch of electric trucks at this time, that little dotted line would move a little bit to the right, and it would result in more coal being added to the grid. You can also picture a time in which the hydro and solar bars, there's maybe a big windstorm, wind bar, and it would stretch all the way to the current electricity demand because it's producing so much energy at that time. And at that time, the marginal emissions rate would be 0. Next slide. And I just wanted to show this is how this looks in one day. So these are the 4 grids we talked about earlier, and I'm plotting the marginal emissions rate throughout the day. So you can see that the coal-heavy grid more or less hovers between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, because most of the time in this grid, you're going to be oscillating between maybe an import or coal. And then as soon as you start adding renewables, the next one down, the green grid, which is our Great Plains region, is the coal renewable mix. And you start seeing that marginal emissions rate kind of oscillate between a really high number and a really low number. And you'll also want to point out that in the nighttime hours between midnight and 7 a.m., it drops close to 0 for much of the night. And this is because of how much wind is on the grid at that time. And then the next grid down is New York. This is our gas-heavy grid. You'll see that it also still hovers a little bit, but at a much lower number because it's hovering around the emissions for natural gas. And because they're integrating wind, you do see a couple big dips in the middle of the night where there's some excess wind generation. And then the last grid, the yellow line at the bottom, is California's grid. And we all know that California has a massive amount of solar energy. So you can see that the emissions rate really drops for the whole middle of the day. And there'll be times where it spikes back up, and that would be natural gas. But for the most part, you get really low emissions during the day in CAISO. Okay, so I just did a quick simulation to show what the potential would be for managed charging based on emissions for an electric truck. So in this simulation, we were looking at getting 500 miles of charge overnight from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So this is assuming a pretty long dwell time. In reality, I know that could vary and it could be much smaller. And then we're looking at a 150 kilowatt charger. So with these specs, you would need about an hour of charging within a 12-hour window, which if we break that down into smaller chunks and choose to put it in places where the emissions rate is lowest, this is what we see. So here on the graph, you can see the red sort of block is showing baseline charging. This would be if you plugged in at 7 p.m. and just charged immediately until it was full and then stopped. And then the yellow lines are if you were using an emissions forecast to choose which times you wanted to charge. And then the table at the bottom just shows over the course of a year, you could see a reduction of 55% of your charging related emissions. And this is in the SPP region. And so this would vary a little bit based on how long your dwell time is, how fast your charger is, but for the most part, we can see between 20 and 80% reduction of emissions by using emissions optimized charging. And then one other thing to note is that this can be co-optimized. So many of our partners are focused on cost optimization, as you can imagine, and as you heard from all the other panelists today. And the thing is that a time of use rate often has a huge block during the night where it's the same price for maybe 8 hours. You could charge within that and charge at the lowest cost, but then you could have one other layer of optimization that's just looking at emissions. So no increase in cost, you could still optimize for cost and then also reduce emissions along the way. Next slide. And that's all. Thank you guys so much, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much, Christy. Thank you to all of our speakers. We've covered a ton of great information today. It's no surprise we have a bunch of great questions, both submitted live and in advance, and we've only got a couple minutes. So I think I'm just going to go with the one that I've seen the most versions of, which is really, there are a lot of managed charging options out there. We've heard from many of you today. If you're a fleet looking to electrify, what distinguishing features should you really be looking for when trying to select a managed charging provider? And I'm sure everyone's got thoughts on this. I might start with Namit. Anything from your end?
Yeah, the main thing, as I shared during our presentation also, the main thing is that you should look at this whole thing as a system. So from that point of view, having a charge management system, there are simple rule-based ones which basically you can set it up in such a way that do not charge in this time window, right? And that is all dependent on the utility, the type of rate structure you have. So that is something which is as simple as that. Then as you move forward, there are more complex ones which are able to look at the whole system, optimize the whole system. So how is your fleet operating? How is each vehicle in your fleet operating? Going all the way to, do you have on-site solar and storage, and what is the grid doing right now in the next 10 minutes? So and optimize it basically at that point in time. So there is a whole range, I would say. In either case, definitely do not go for uncontrolled, absolutely go for the lowest one possible to start with. But yes, the system level and looking at the whole thing, there are controllers which optimizes across that. So those would be the best one to look at.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Who else? Like Levi, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different things that obviously go into selecting managed charging software, and a lot of it kind of depends on both the use case of your particular fleet and the complexities that you're dealing with. So echoing, a lot of what Scott talked about, really picking a software management company that is going to be more of a partner rather than a vendor, as cliche as that sounds. It's really important because there's a lot of learning and testing that goes into understanding how managed charging works, not just for your operation, but into the future and what that development looks like. I think two other really key points to hit is you probably want to pick something that's going to be brand agnostic. The reason being, you need a managed charging software that's going to allow you to pivot to the best-in-class technologies as technologies develop. And then the last and kind of final thing is probably a favorable data policy, right? Because again, this as a fleet operator gives you the flexibility to pivot to best-in-class technologies. You want to make sure that your data is yours and that you can utilize it to make your decisions and that you can take it with you in the future. So if for whatever reason you were to change software companies or change hardware or blend different types of infrastructure, whether that's a microgrid, level 2 and level 3 charging, that you're going to be able to have all of the data and all of the insight that you've built over the time that you've invested into your electrification to be able to do that more intelligently in the future, and you're not starting back from ground zero.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Levi. If we could go to the last slide, I see we are at time, so we're gonna have to cut it there. Obviously, a ton of questions we didn't get to. So again, I invite you all to think about joining us at ACT Expo this fall as we talk through some of the issues we didn't have time for today. Also, let us know what you enjoyed, what we can improve going forward via the survey. You'll get a link in your email. And if you want to test your knowledge, we've covered a ton of great material today. You can do that via the quiz on runonless.com. Otherwise, I want to say thank you to everyone for attending. A huge thank you to our panel today. Great job, everyone. And we hope folks will join us in 2 weeks for the next session where we'll be talking more about charging, but from the perspective of working with your utility. So thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you all.